The morning of December 7, 1941, arrives the way all beautiful mornings do, without warning and without apology. The sun lifts itself slowly over the Ko'olau Mountains and floods the harbor in gold. The water is almost perfectly still. Oahu smells of plumeria and diesel fuel and salt. Palm trees move in a languid breeze that carries nothing threatening, nothing heavy, nothing that could possibly belong to the last hours of peace. Aboard the USS Arizona, a young sailor named James nobody in particular looks at the harbor from the deck and thinks, as young men always do, that there is no more beautiful place in the world. He is 19 years old. He has not been home in 4 months. He thinks about the girl back in Oklahoma. He thinks about breakfast. He thinks, vaguely, about church. It is Sunday, after all. It is always Sunday in the stories that end this way. Across the harbor, sailors are returning from liberty in small boats, still slightly unsteady from the night before. Officers read the morning paper over coffee. A few men fish off the stern of the Nevada. Cooks below deck crack eggs onto hot griddles. On the USS Oklahoma, a record player somewhere below is turning, pushing music up through the steel corridors and out into the warm Hawaiian air. In Honolulu, 6 miles from the harbor, church bells are beginning to ring. Families dress for mass. Children eat breakfast. A woman hangs laundry in her yard and looks at the sky and sees nothing, absolutely nothing, that is not beautiful. This is the world as it still exists. This is the last moment of it. But somewhere beyond those mountains, somewhere over the dark expanse of the Pacific that the United States Navy had long considered its own private ocean, something was already moving. Something that had been planned for months, organized in absolute secrecy, launched in the darkness of pre-dawn, and was now, at this very second, cutting through the thin cold air above the clouds at 180 miles per hour. They were already coming, and no one on the ground had any idea. What you need to understand, what is almost impossible to fully understand from the safe distance of history, is how completely and utterly impossible this all seemed. Not unlikely. Impossible. The United States military at Pearl Harbor was the most concentrated display of naval power the Pacific had ever seen. 8 battleships. Nearly 100 other vessels. Hundreds of aircraft. Tens of thousands of men. Hawaii was not a frontier. It was a fortress. It was a statement. The idea that an enemy force could travel thousands of miles across open ocean, undetected, and then rain destruction down on all of it, the idea simply did not fit inside the frame of what American commanders believed was possible. That was the first catastrophic mistake. At 7:02 in the morning, inside a mobile radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu, Army Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott are finishing what had been a quiet and largely uneventful night shift. They are almost done. In 20 minutes they are supposed to shut down the equipment and head to breakfast. But as Lockard makes one final sweep of the screen, he sees something that stops him. 2 blips. Then more. A large formation. More aircraft than he has ever seen appear on radar at once. He stares at the screen. Elliott stares at the screen. The blips are real. They are large. They are moving directly toward Oahu at a speed that does not belong to any friendly training exercise. Lockard picks up the phone and calls the information center at Fort Shafter. He reaches a junior duty officer who has never encountered a situation like this and who does the thing that people do when they encounter situations they have never encountered. He assumes a simpler explanation must exist. He tells Lockard that a flight of American B-17 bombers is expected from the mainland that morning. Don't worry about it. Lockard is not fully satisfied. He watches the screen. The formation is enormous. 50+ aircraft, maybe more. Still moving. Still coming. But the call has been made and the answer has been given, and the duty officer at Fort Shafter goes back to his Sunday morning, and the radar operators at Opana Point watch the blips move across the screen and move closer and closer until, at 7:39 a.m., The formation disappears into a dead zone in the equipment, and Lockhart concludes, incorrectly, fatally, that there is nothing more to do. He and Elliot close up the station. They go to breakfast. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda is flying at the head of the first wave. He is one of the most decorated naval aviators in the Japanese Imperial Navy, a man who has spent the last several months preparing for this moment with the kind of quiet, iron precision that military history tends to remember as genius and that, in the moment, simply looks like a man doing his job. He is flying a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber. Beneath him, in the gray pre-light of early morning, the clouds break apart and through them, for the first time, he can see Oahu. He can see Pearl Harbor. And it is exactly, as the reconnaissance photographs promised it would be. The ships are there. The battleships are moored in two parallel rows along the southeastern shore of Ford Island. The Americans call it Battleship Row, sitting in the harbor like beautiful, enormous, and completely stationary targets. Fukuda later writes that in that moment he felt something complex and contradictory, the cold focus of a professional, and something beneath it that he cannot quite name. He would carry that feeling for the rest of his life. He fires a flare. The signal for attack. 183 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and Zero fighters, begin their descent. It is 7:48 in the morning. The first bombs fall on Hickam Field, the Army Air Corps base adjacent to Pearl Harbor, and for a moment, a single, fractured, surreal moment, the men on the ground do not understand what is happening. They hear the explosions. They see the smoke rising. One officer looks up at aircraft flying low over the field and initially, genuinely, believes this is some kind of training exercise that nobody told him about. An army man nearby shouts at one of the planes as it banks overhead. Then he sees the red circles on the wings. The Japanese torpedo planes are already turning toward Battleship Row. They come in low, impossibly low, skimming just above the water, their engines screaming, their pilots locked onto targets that are not moving, that cannot move, that are moored in place and lined up in rows and sitting in shallow water in the stillest hours of a Sunday morning. The torpedoes drop. They enter the water at precise angles, modified with wooden fins especially for this shallow harbor because the Americans had believed, wrongly, that torpedoes could not function in water this depth. The Americans believed a great many things that morning that turned out not to be true. The USS Oklahoma takes 3 torpedo hits in rapid succession. Then a 4th. Then a 5th. She is already listing badly to port. Men inside her lower compartments feel the ship tilt and know, in the wordless, animal way that the body knows things before the mind catches up, that she is going over. Hatches jam. Water begins pouring through. Men scramble toward the upper decks. Some make it. Many do not. The Oklahoma rolls 160 degrees. She is upside down. She is upside down in the harbor at 7:55 in the morning on a Sunday in December, and there are men trapped inside her, and the harbor around her is already beginning to fill with oil and fire. On the deck of the USS West Virginia, a young enlisted man named Doris Miller, a messman, which in the Navy of 1941 meant that he was black, and black men in the Navy of 1941 were not allowed to be anything else, feels the first torpedo strike as a physical blow to the entire ship. He is below deck doing laundry. He runs up to the main deck and finds a world he cannot recognize. His ship is taking on water. His commanding officer, Captain Mervyn Benyon, has been struck by shrapnel and is dying on the bridge. The anti-aircraft guns are unmanned. Doris Miller has never been trained to fire a gun. He takes a position at a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun and begins firing at Japanese aircraft. He will not stop for over an hour. The dive bombers hit Hickam Field with devastating precision. The aircraft parked in neat, tidy rows on the tarmac. Parked that way, in part, because the Army had been worried about sabotage from the ground and wanted the planes where they could be easily guarded. Those aircraft are destroyed almost immediately. Hangars collapse. The fire consumes everything. Men who had been sleeping in barracks minutes ago are now running through burning buildings, trying to reach aircraft they cannot reach. At the Naval Air Station at Ford Island, same story. Kaneohe Bay, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field. Every American airfield on Oahu is under simultaneous attack. This was not an accident. This was architecture. The Japanese planners had known that the greatest threat to the success of the attack was American air power. If American fighters could scramble before the Japanese aircraft completed their runs, the damage to the strike force could be catastrophic. So the airfields were hit first. The aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The runways were cratered. And the handful of American pilots who managed to get airborne, a handful out of hundreds, found themselves outnumbered and fighting the most skilled naval aviators in the Pacific. But the airfields, as terrible as the destruction was, were not the true target. The battleships were the true target. You have to understand what Battleship Row looked like in those minutes. Really understand it, to feel the full weight of what was happening. These were not abstract vessels. These were the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, the USS California, the USS Maryland, the USS Tennessee, the USS Nevada, the USS Pennsylvania. These were names that carried the full mythological weight of American military power. These were ships that had been built with enormous national pride, crewed by tens of thousands of American men, and positioned at Pearl Harbor as the visible embodiment of American dominance in the Pacific. Within 20 minutes of the first torpedo strike, most of them were either sinking, burning, or both. And then, at 8:06 in the morning, the USS Arizona died. A Japanese horizontal bomber released an armor-piercing shell, a modified 40-centimeter naval shell fitted with fins to serve as a bomb, and it fell in a shallow arc and struck the Arizona forward of the bridge, near the No. 2 gun turret, and it penetrated the deck and it reached the forward ammunition magazine. What happened next was not an explosion. It was an annihilation. Approximately 1 million pounds of gunpowder ignited simultaneously. The forward section of the Arizona was obliterated. The fireball rose so high it was visible from miles away. The shockwave crossed the harbor and knocked men off their feet on the decks of neighboring ships. The sound arrived a half-second after the light. A sound that survivors would describe for the rest of their lives as something beyond any word the English language had for loud. It was a sound like the world cracking open, like the bottom falling out of everything. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes. 1,177 men went down with her. In 9 minutes. 9 minutes is not very long. 9 minutes is the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, to read the sports section, to walk from one end of a ship to the other. In 9 minutes, more than 1,000 young American men who had woken up that morning to Sunday, to breakfast, to a beautiful December day in Hawaii, ceased to exist. The ship is still sinking. The harbor itself is on fire. At 8:54 in the morning, the second wave arrives. 167 aircraft. The American anti-aircraft response is now significantly more organized. The initial shock has given way to something hard and furious, and American sailors are firing back with everything they have. But the damage is already done, and the second wave comes in anyway, and the bombs keep falling, and the harbor keeps burning, and the smoke rises so thick and so black that Japanese pilots in the second wave have to navigate by the edges of the cloud. The USS Nevada, miraculously, has managed to get underway. She is the only battleship to move during the attack. Her crew, many of them new to the ship, some of them fighting fires while simultaneously working the engines, has somehow gotten her moving, and she is heading for the harbor entrance, heading for open water. And for a few extraordinary minutes she represents something like hope against the absolute devastation of everything around her. Then the Japanese dive bombers find her. They hit her 5 times. 6 times. They are trying to sink her in the channel, which would block the harbor entrance and trap every other vessel inside. The Nevada's captain makes a brutal calculation and beaches her deliberately rather than risk blocking the channel. She runs aground near the harbor entrance, burning and listing, but afloat. She will fight again. Many of the men aboard her will not. At Tripler Army Medical Center, at the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor, at every medical facility on Oahu, doctors and nurses who had been sleeping or having breakfast minutes ago are now working in conditions that no training had fully prepared them for. The wounded are arriving faster than anyone can process them. Some men arrive with burns covering 60, 70, 80% of their bodies. Some arrive still covered in the harbor's burning oil. Some arrive with wounds that no doctor should be asked to describe. The hospitals run out of blood. They run out of morphine. They run out of everything. Navy Nurse Corps Lieutenant Ruth Erickson later remembers seeing the first casualties come through the doors and thinking, with the strange clarity that crisis sometimes produces, that she was looking at something she had never been trained to see. Not the wounds themselves. She had seen wounds. But the scale of it. The sheer, overwhelming, relentless scale of it. The wounded keep coming. They will keep coming for hours. That message, Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Goes out at 7:58 in the morning, sent by the duty officer at the Naval District Headquarters, and it travels instantaneously to ships and stations across the Pacific and to naval commands in Washington, D.C., and it lands like a physical object on the desks of men who read it and then read it again because the first reading cannot possibly have been correct. In Washington, it is 1:30 in the afternoon. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox reads the message and says, out loud to no one in particular, "My God, this can't be true." Then he picks up the phone and calls the White House. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is in his study. He has been president for nearly 9 years. He has guided the country through the worst economic collapse in its history. He has watched Europe burn and has felt the impossible pressure of a country that desperately wanted to stay out of the war and a world that was making staying out increasingly untenable. He has threaded political needles of extraordinary delicacy. He is, by this point in his presidency, a man who believes he has seen most of what history can produce. He has not seen this. The call comes through at 1:47 in the afternoon, Washington time. Knox tells him what has happened. Roosevelt listens without speaking for a long moment. Then he begins to work. The question that hangs over Washington in those first hours, the question that hangs over every military commander, every intelligence official, every political leader who receives the news, is not just what happened. It is how. How did a Japanese fleet travel thousands of miles across the Pacific without being detected? How did 183 aircraft appear over Pearl Harbor without any effective warning? How did the most powerful naval installation in the Pacific get caught? That word, caught, which everyone will use and no one will fully accept, completely by surprise. The answers, when they come, will be complicated and disturbing, and will implicate not just individual failures but systemic ones. Failures of imagination, failures of communication, failures of the particular kind of confidence that becomes blindness when left unchallenged. But that accounting is for later. Right now, there is only the harbor. The attack ends at 9:55 in the morning. It has lasted 1 hour and 53 minutes. In that time, the Japanese strike force has sunk or severely damaged all 8 American battleships. They have destroyed or damaged nearly 350 aircraft. They have killed 2,403 Americans. They have wounded another 1,178. The Japanese lose 29 aircraft and 64 men. What follows the noise is a silence that survivors will describe as somehow worse than the attack itself. The harbor is still. The fires are still burning, they will burn for days, but the planes are gone and the explosions have stopped, and what remains is a scene of destruction so complete that the men standing in it cannot immediately process what their eyes are showing them. A sailor sits on a dock and stares at the place where the Arizona used to be. He is not crying. He is not screaming. He is just staring. He will sit there for a long time. Inside the hospitals, the work does not stop when the attack ends. It will not stop for days. Surgeons operate for 16, 18, 20 hours straight. Nurses who have been on their feet since before the attack change dressings and administer morphine, and hold the hands of men who are dying, and occasionally step outside for a breath of air that still smells of smoke and burning oil and something else. Something that all of them will later try to find words for, and none of them fully will. In the harbor, rescue operations begin almost immediately. Divers go into the wreckage of the Oklahoma, which lies upside down in the mud, and they tap the hull, tap it in patterns, and listen for tapping in return. There are men alive inside the overturned hull. 32 of them will be rescued by cutting through the hull with tools. Many more will not be. They will tap for days. In Honolulu, civilians have been listening to explosions they could not at first explain. Some initially thought it was military training, unusual for a Sunday, but military training nonetheless. Then the smoke appeared over the mountains in the direction of Pearl Harbor, and the radio stations went quiet, and then came back on with voices that were strange and tense, and saying things that nobody was ready to hear. A woman named Cornelia Fort, a civilian flight instructor, was in the air that morning in a small training aircraft. She saw the Japanese planes. She saw them clearly. She saw the red circles on the wings. She dove her plane toward the airfield and barely landed before the airfield itself was attacked. She spent the rest of the morning watching the harbor burn from the ground. She later wrote that the thing she kept thinking, standing there watching the smoke, was how normal the morning had been just an hour before. By early afternoon, wire services across the country are moving the story. Newspapers are printing emergency editions. Radio stations interrupt regular programming with bulletins that grow increasingly urgent and increasingly devastating as the full scope of what has happened comes into focus. Across the United States, in living rooms and diners and church halls and barbershops, Americans gather around radios and listen to a story that does not seem real. A story about Pearl Harbor. A story about the Pacific Fleet. A story about battleships sinking and men dying on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, which is a place that most Americans have never been and think of, vaguely, as very far away and very peaceful and very safe. The word that people use over and over again, throughout the afternoon and evening of December 7th, is unthinkable. They mean it literally. By the morning of December 8th, the full shape of what has happened is beginning to emerge. The casualty numbers. The ship losses. The destroyed aircraft. The scale of the surprise. All of it settling into a picture that is both clearer and more terrible than anyone had hoped. And the country is waiting. Not because it doesn't know what comes next. The country knows what comes next. The country has known, somewhere beneath all of its insistence on staying out of the war, what comes next since September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland and the world began its terrible unraveling. The country has known and has tried not to know, has talked itself into believing that the distance was protection, that the oceans were barriers, that what happened in Europe and in Asia was not, could not be, its problem. December 7, 1941, has settled that argument. Roosevelt appears before a joint session of Congress at 12:30 in the afternoon. He has been working through the night. The bags under his eyes are visible from the gallery. His voice, when it comes, is steady in the way that things are steady when they have been deliberately made so, when steadiness is itself a choice and a hard one. He says, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He speaks for 7 minutes. He catalogues the other attacks that have accompanied Pearl Harbor, on Malaya, on Hong Kong, on Guam, on the Philippine Islands, on Wake Island, on Midway. He makes clear that Pearl Harbor was not an isolated event, but the opening move of something enormous. He speaks with the precision of a man who has chosen every word carefully, and the gravity of a man who knows exactly what he is asking the country to do. And then he asks Congress to declare that a state of war exists between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote takes less than an hour. America is at war. But a declaration of war is an abstraction. What is not an abstraction is the harbor, which is still burning on December 8th. Still burning on December 9th. The oil from the sunken ships seeps up through the water and spreads across the surface and burns, and the smoke rises, and the men who are working in and around the harbor breathe that smoke and will carry something of it in their lungs for the rest of their lives. What is not an abstraction is the fear. Because after the attack ends, a new terror settles over Hawaii and over the west coast of the United States. The fear that this was not the end of something but the beginning. The fear that the Japanese fleet is still out there. The fear that the next wave is coming. In Hawaii, blackout orders go into effect immediately. Windows are covered. Lights are extinguished. The island prepares for an invasion that, as it turns out, will not come. But in the days after December 7th, no one knows that. On the west coast of the United States, the fear is visceral and immediate. San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, cities that have never thought of themselves as vulnerable, that have always felt that the Pacific Ocean was their protection, suddenly feel that the Pacific Ocean is something else entirely. Something that an enemy crossed once and might cross again. There are rumors. There are always rumors in the hours after catastrophe. Rumors of Japanese submarines off the coast. Rumors of a second attack. Rumors of sabotage. Most of the rumors are wrong. Some of them, particularly the submarine rumors, are not entirely wrong, which makes the atmosphere of fear even harder to manage. The Japanese-American communities on the West Coast, men and women and children who are American citizens, who were born here, who know no other country, will pay a terrible and entirely unjust price for this fear in the months to come. That too is part of what Pearl Harbor set in motion. The men who dive on the wrecks in the weeks and months after the attack are met with scenes that stay with them forever. Inside the Oklahoma, inside the Arizona, inside the West Virginia and the California, they find the evidence of a morning interrupted. Half-eaten breakfasts. Playing cards. A uniform hung neatly for Sunday morning inspection. Letters that were never mailed. A Bible. A photograph. The people in the photographs do not know yet what has happened. The photographs were taken before. History is full of befores and afters, but most of us never feel the precise moment of transition. We look back and say, before the war, after the war. Before the diagnosis, after the diagnosis. Before everything changed. But we almost never feel the precise second of the knife's edge. The moment that everything on one side differs absolutely from everything on the other side. The men and women of Pearl Harbor felt it. Some of them felt it as a sound, the first explosion, or the first alarm, or the sound of an aircraft engine dropping in pitch as it lined up on a target. Some of them felt it as a physical sensation, the ship shuddering beneath them, the world tilting, the sudden heat of fire. Some of them felt it as a visual, a formation of aircraft appearing over the ridge of the mountains, and the sun catching the red circles on the wings, and the moment of pure perceptual confusion before the mind accepts what the eyes are reporting. They were standing in the last second of the before. And then there was no more before. What is perhaps the most haunting aspect of Pearl Harbor? More than the death toll, more than the tactical surprise, more than the geopolitical consequences, is its ordinariness. The morning that preceded it. The coffee and the card games and the Sunday newspaper and the church bells. The young men writing letters home and the nurses sleeping before their shifts and the radar operators watching their screens and the officers assuming that the large formation on the screen was a flight of friendly bombers because what else would it be? The world does not announce itself when it is about to change. It does not clear its throat. It does not offer warning. It moves through the ordinary world in complete disguise right up until the moment it tears the ordinary world apart. The USS Arizona Memorial stands over the wreck today. White. Stark. Suspended above the water so that you are always aware, when standing on it, that there is something beneath you. Something that went down in 9 minutes one Sunday morning in December. something that has been down there for more than 80 years now, something that still weeps oil to the surface in what the memorial's guides call, quietly, the Arizona's tears. Below the water, inside the hull, 1,177 men are still there. They were never recovered. The ship is their grave. The attack on Pearl Harbor lasted 1 hour and 53 minutes. The United States would be at war for the next 3 years, 10 months, and 19 days. That war would kill somewhere between 70 and 85 million people before it ended, making it by orders of magnitude the deadliest event in human history. It would reshape every border on the map. It would end empires and begin others. It would produce nuclear weapons and the cold logic of mutually assured destruction, and a world living perpetually under a shadow that it had not previously known how to imagine. All of that begins here. All of it traces back to this harbor, this morning, this oil on the water. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from suddenness, from the way that catastrophe doesn't announce itself, doesn't wait for you to be ready, doesn't give you time to arrange your affairs or say what you meant to say or finish your breakfast or make peace with anything at all. It just arrives. In the middle of an ordinary morning. With the coffee still warm and the church bells still ringing and the harbor still golden in the early sun. The men and women of December 7, 1941, did not know they were living in the last moments of a world. None of us ever do. The smoke eventually disappeared. The memory never did.